take off your sock. Look at the groove it left around your ankle. Press your thumb into the skin beside the groove for 5 seconds. Watch the indent. Count how long it takes to disappear. That groove is measuring something most people have never been told is there. The puffiness beneath your eyes at 7 in the evening, absent at 7 in the morning. You can test this yourself. Compare your face in the bathroom mirror when you wake up to your face in that mirror 12 hours later. The morning face is leaner, cheekbones more visible, jawline sharper. By evening, the face has softened. Fluid has redistributed from the overnight horizontal position into the dependent tissues, and the glycogen-bound water that was partially mobilized during the overnight fast, when the liver drew down its glycogen reserves to maintain blood glucose through the sleeping hours, has been fully replenished by the day's meals. Your ring slides off less easily than it did 3 years ago, not because the finger grew, but because the interstitial fluid volume in the fingers has increased incrementally as the glycogen stores maintained their chronic level year after year. The belt notch that moved one position without a change in how much you eat. Substrate-bound fluid adding volume to the abdominal tissue in a layer no amount of core exercise can reach because it is not muscular, and it is not fat. The face in the mirror after lunch, slightly softer at the jawline, slightly blurred where the chin meets the neck. Most adults over 55 assign all of this to aging. The assignment is not wrong, it is incomplete. Aging does produce tissue changes, collagen cross-linking, reduced lymphatic drainage, decreased skin elasticity. These are real and irreversible on the timeline of a human life. But layered on top of these genuine aging effects is a separate, reversible component, the mechanical output of a glucose signal that has been running chronically for decades. The two effects look identical from the outside. The puffiness from glycogen-bound water and the puffiness from age-related lymphatic slowing produce identical visual restuntance. The ring tightness from interstitial fluid retention and the ring tightness from joint changes feel identical on the finger. The afternoon heaviness from glucose turbulence and the afternoon heaviness from age-related sleep fragmentation land in the body at an identical hour with an identical quality of fatigue. There is only one way to distinguish the reversible component from the irreversible one. Remove the substrate and observe what changes. What reverses within 21 days was substrate-driven. What remains after 21 days is structural aging. The experiment separates the two, and for most adults over 55, the substrate-driven component is larger than they expect. The body stores carbohydrate as glycogen, approximately 600 grams total, distributed across skeletal muscle and liver. Each gram of glycogen binds approximately 3 grams of water. Olson and Sultan established this ratio at the Karolinska Institute in 1970 through direct muscle biopsy, measuring glycogen content in tissue water simultaneously in identical specimens. 600 grams of glycogen means approximately 1.8 kilograms of water held in your tissue. Not free-floating water moving through the bloodstream, structurally bound water, hydrogen bonded to the glycogen molecules held in the muscle fibers and liver cells alongside the fuel it is attached to. This water distributes everywhere, glycogen distributes. The skeletal muscles hold 500 grams of glycogen and 1.5 kilograms of attached water, spread through every major muscle group. The liver holds 80 grams of glycogen and 240 grams of attached water. Smaller amounts reside in the kidneys, the brain, and the cardiac muscle. The water shows up in your face as subcutaneous fluid overlying the cheekbones and the orbital rims. In your ankles as interstitial fluid in the dependent tissues where gravity concentrates it. In your fingers as the slight swelling that makes the ring tighter in the evening. In your midsection as the soft fullness that exercise does not change because it is not fat, it is substrate-bound fluid occupying volume, no movement can specifically target. When the sugar signal stops arriving, when the substrate that has been replenishing that glycogen store daily for decades is removed, the glycogen depletes and the water it was anchoring leaves with it. The liver glycogen goes first because the liver uses glycogen to maintain blood glucose between meals. The muscle glycogen follows more slowly over 2 to 5 days. The face changes shape before the waistline does. The ring loosens before the scale moves meaningfully. The sock groove shallows before any fat is lost. The early change is water, substrate-bound fluid leaving tissue where it has been held for years, and it begins within 48 hours. What happens after the water, organ by organ, system by system, across 21 days, is the physics this timeline reaches past its midpoint. 3 measurements taken today turn the substrate experiment from an abstraction into personal data. The sock groove, photograph it at the end of the day, note the depth, press the skin, and time the indent recovery in seconds. The longer the indent persists, the more interstitial fluid is present in the tissue. A recovery time of 3 seconds or less indicates minimal fluid retention. 5 seconds or more indicates the glycogen-bound water may be contributing significantly to the tissue volume. Ring test. Slide the ring on and off the finger you normally wear it on. Note the resistance. The ring tightness is measuring interstitial fluid in the fingers. Identical glycogen-bound water the sock groove measures at the ankle, distributed to the hands by an identical storage mechanism. Face photograph, neutral lighting, straight ahead, same conditions you will repeat on day 7, day 14, and day 21. The comparison is not looking for dramatic transformation. It is looking for the periorbital puffiness around the eyes and the jawline definition that change as subcutaneous glycogen-bound water redistributes. The face changes before the waistline because the tissue is thinner and the water is closer to the surface. A 100-gram reduction in facial fluid produces a visible change, while a 100-gram reduction in abdominal fluid produces none. These are not clinical measurements, they are personal reference points that anchor the physics to your own tissue. 4 hours after the last sugar-containing meal, circulating insulin falls below the fasting threshold, approximately 5 to 8 microunits per milliliter. This number matters because insulin is a gate. While insulin is elevated, the body runs on the glucose it just received. Hormone-sensitive lipase, the enzyme that liberates stored fatty acids from adipocytes, is suppressed by insulin's presence. The body cannot efficiently access its stored fat while insulin is telling every cell that glucose is available and plentiful. The fat stays locked in the adipocytes. The body burns what just arrived. Below the fasting threshold, the gate opens. Hormone-sensitive lipase activates as insulin's inhibitory signal weakens. The body begins accessing stored fat rather than running exclusively on the most recent glucose delivery. This transition happens automatically. No decision required, no willpower involved, no conscious metabolic shift. The biochemistry responds to the absence of the substrate. The insulin drops because the glucose stopped arriving. The lipase activates because the insulin dropped. Each step follows mechanically from the previous one. Insulin sensitivity follows a circadian rhythm, highest in the morning when the body expects food, lowest in the evening when the body expects rest. Here the insulin is declining for a different reason, not because the clock moved to its evening trough, but because the substrate stopped arriving at the portal vein. The liver shifts from glycogen synthesis to glycogenolysis, breaking down its stored glycogen to maintain blood glucose within the narrow range the brain requires. The brain consumes approximately 120 grams of glucose per day and cannot tolerate significant deviation from the 4 to 6 millimoles per liter range. The liver's glycogen store exists primarily to serve this neural demand between meals. You do not feel the shift. It is biochemical, subclinical, detectable only through blood sampling. But it is the prerequisite for everything that follows, the hormonal gate that must open before any of the downstream metabolic changes, the liver fat clearance, the glucose stabilization, the insulin receptor upregulation, can begin. Liver glycogen, approximately 80 grams, depletes within 12 to 18 hours. The fasting script described this transition as the metabolic switch to ketone production, the liver shifting from glucose export to ketone body synthesis as its glycogen reserves empty and the body requires an alternative fuel for the brain. The new dimension, the water that was bound to that glycogen, leaves with it. 80 grams of liver glycogen anchored approximately 240 grams of water. As the glycogen molecules break apart, cleaved one glucose unit at a time by glycogen phosphorylase, each glucose exported into the bloodstream to feed the brain, the water molecules that were hydrogen bonded to the glycogen structure have nothing left to bind to. The water enters the bloodstream, increases the plasma volume transiently, is filtered by the kidneys at the glomerulus, and exits as urine. Urination increases in the first 24 to 48 hours. Not because you are drinking more, but because your body is releasing water that was structurally bound to a fuel substrate that no longer exists. The increase is modest, an extra 200 to 300 milliliters per day, but it is consistent and it is the first measurable signal that the glycogen stores are depleting. Muscle glycogen. approximately 500 grams across all skeletal muscles, depletes more slowly, 2 to 5 days depending on activity level and the intensity of any movement during the transition period. Unlike liver glycogen, muscle glycogen is not exported as glucose into the bloodstream. It is consumed locally by the muscle fibers during contraction. Walking, climbing stairs, carrying groceries, each activity draws down the local glycogen store in the muscles that perform the work. As each muscle's glycogen depletes, the 1.5 kilograms of water bound to it releases from the muscle tissue into the interstitial space, enters the lymphatic and venous drainage, and exits through the kidneys. Total glycogen-bound water released across the first 5 days, approximately 1.8 kilograms. The scale drops before any fat is oxidized. 2 kilograms of weight lost without 2 kilograms of fat burned. The scale is accurate. The interpretation is where most people go wrong. This arithmetic matters because it prevents misinterpretation. The first 3 to 5 days are water and glycogen, not fat. Fat oxidation begins in parallel and accelerates as insulin drops further. Hormone-sensitive lipase is now active. Free fatty acids are being mobilized from adipocytes, and the liver is producing ketone bodies to replace the glucose the brain was running on. With a dramatic early-scale movement, the 2 to 3 kilograms that disappear in the first week, is primarily glycogen-bound water leaving tissue where it has been held for years. The change is real. The mechanism is hydraulic, not metabolic. Understanding the difference matters practically. When the substrate returns, when sugar and refined carbohydrate resume, the glycogen stores refill within 24 to 48 hours, and the water rebinds. The scale jumps back by the same 1.8 kilograms. The person who thought they lost fat panics. The person who understood the water mechanism expects the rebound and interprets it correctly. The glycogen refilled, and the water came back with it. No fat was regained. The scale is measuring substrate-bound water returning to the tissue it was always stored in. Well, the morning I opened the day 0 and day 7 photographs side by side, the difference was visible without measurement. The periorbital puffiness, the slight swelling beneath the eyes that I had filed under aging, under poor sleep, under just what faces look like past 50, had reduced. The jawline was marginally more defined, not dramatic in the way an advertisement presents dramatic. Specific. Water had left the tissue closest to the surface, and the face reflected the departure before any other region could. You know what leaves first: water. You know why. Glycogen depletion releasing its bound fluid on a timeline that begins at 12 hours and completes by day 5. The question changes from what the body releases to what the organs do once the substrate pressure lifts, because the water departure is the opening act. The liver, the pancreas, the kidneys, and the afternoon itself all respond on their own timelines once an identical signal stops arriving. By day 5, the liver's assembly line has slowed, stops arriving. Schwartz and colleagues at the University of California, San Francisco demonstrated this in Cell Metabolism in 2017. They enrolled 41 subjects and replaced dietary fructose with isocaloric starch. Same total calories, same protein, same fat, only the sugar variable changed. They measured with MRI, magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and stable isotope tracers. In 9 days, median liver fat fell from 7.2 to 3.8%, fractional de novo lipogenesis. The rate at which the liver converts incoming substrate to new fat collapsed from 68% to 26%. Visceral fat decreased from 123 cubic centimeters to 110. All 3 results with p-values below 0.01. No calorie deficit, no exercise intervention, 1 variable changed. Evidence calibration. Schwartz measured these changes in obese children and adolescents aged 9 to 18. The hepatic de novo lipogenesis pathway is identical in adults. Fructose enters the liver through the portal vein and feeds an identical lipogenic cascade regardless of age. The biochemistry does not change with age. The direction of the response is expected to be equivalent in adults. The specific magnitudes, the percentage drops, the timeline, have not been replicated in an adult cohort at this exact protocol. The physics is strong. The population context belongs with the numbers. De novo lipogenesis is the assembly line the liver runs when fructose arrives faster than the liver can oxidize it for energy. Fructose enters through the portal vein and bypasses the phosphofructokinase checkpoint that controls glucose metabolism, the regulatory brake that slows processing when the liver is already saturated. Without this brake, fructose feeds directly into the lipogenic pathway, acetyl-CoA to malonyl-CoA to fatty acid synthase to palmitate to triglycerides. The line runs continuously when the substrate arrives continuously. Remove the substrate and the line has nothing to process. The enzymes are still present. The mitochondrial pathways are still functional. The fatty acid synthase complex is still assembled in the hepatocyte cytoplasm. But without fructose arriving through the portal vein to feed acetyl-CoA into the top of the pathway, the entire chain sits idle. The rate collapses, not because the machinery broke, but because the raw material stopped arriving. The liver did not malfunction during the years of elevated lipogenesis. It processed what arrived with the efficiency the biochemistry demands. Change what arrives, and the processing changes with it. Evening carbohydrate converts to triglycerides more readily than morning carbohydrate. An identical meal produces more hepatic fat when consumed at 8 in the evening than at 8 in the morning, because the circadian enzyme activity favors lipogenesis in the evening hours. Remove the substrate entirely and the lipogenesis pathway decelerates at every hour. The liver answers in days, not months. Now, the afternoon changes. The heaviness at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, the narrowing of focus, the negotiation with every task after lunch. Most adults attribute this to aging or poor sleep or both. Part of it is the physiological aftermath of postprandial glucose turbulence. A high glycemic lunch produces a blood sugar spike peaking at 30 to 60 minutes. The spike triggers a proportional insulin surge. The insulin drives glucose into cells faster than it arrives from digestion. Blood glucose overshoots downward. Reactive hypoglycemia, dipping below the fasting baseline at 60 to 90 minutes post-meal. A cortisol and adrenaline rescue follows the dip. Stress hormones mobilize liver glycogen to restore glucose. The rescue produces the jittery, tired hybrid that most people know as the afternoon crash. Not a single sensation, but a compound. Mental fog from the glucose nadir, physical restlessness from the adrenaline release, irritability from the cortisol, all arriving simultaneously and resolving within 30 to 45 minutes as the liver glycogen rescues blood glucose back to baseline. And then, the cycle is not limited to lunch. It runs after every high glycemic meal. Breakfast produces a smaller version at mid-morning, the 10:30 dip that sends people to the coffee machine. Dinner produces a version at 9 or 10 in the evening, the post-dinner drowsiness that most people attribute to a long day, but is partly a glucose nadir arriving on schedule 90 minutes after the meal. 3 cycles per day, each one triggering a cortisol rescue, each rescue adding to the cumulative cortisol load the body carries by evening. The compound effect across decades, the body runs 3 stress hormone rescue cycles daily that it would not run if the substrate driving the glucose turbulence were absent. By day 7 to 10, the glucose turbulence has stabilized. Fasting glucose is lower. Postprandial excursions are smaller because the meals no longer contain the refined carbohydrate driving the spike crash cycle. The insulin surge is proportionally reduced, the reactive dip disappears, and the cortisol rescue stops firing. The afternoon becomes metabolically flat. Steady glucose, steady energy, no crash, no rescue. The mid-morning coffee becomes optional rather than mandatory. The post-dinner drowsiness lifts. Now, the Nocturia script described the gravitational mechanism for nighttime bladder filling. Fluid pooled in the legs during the day redistributes centrally when the body lies flat, filling the bladder at 1 and 3 in the morning. That mechanism is real and operates independently of glucose. This adds a second mechanism, osmotic diuresis from hyperglycemia. When blood glucose exceeds the kidney's reabsorption threshold, approximately 180 milligrams per deciliter, glucose spills into the renal filtrate. Glucose in the filtrate is osmotically active. It pulls water with it. Higher glucose in the filtrate means more water in the urine, means a bladder that fills faster than the vasopressin concentration mechanism can counteract. Most adults with prediabetes experience postprandial glucose excursions above this threshold without knowing it. The spike peaks at 1 to 2 hours after a high glycemic meal and returns to baseline before the next fasting blood draw. The physician never sees it on the standard morning test because the standard test measures fasting glucose, the valley, not the peak. The excursion above 180 happens and resolves between office visits. A continuous glucose monitor would capture it. A fasting blood test cannot. You experience it as a bladder appointment 4 hours later, the osmotic water reaching the bladder during sleep, filling it on a timeline that has nothing to do with how much water you drank before bed, and everything to do with how high your glucose spiked after dinner. By day 10 to 14, the postprandial excursions have flattened below the renal threshold. The osmotic diuresis resolves. The bladder stops filling from the glucose-driven pathway. The gravitational mechanism may still contribute, the leg fluid redistribution still operates, but the glucose-driven component, often the larger contributor in pre-diabetic adults, has been removed. The viewer waking twice per night may find themselves waking once or not at all. The change is renal, not neurological, a threshold that is no longer being breached because the glucose that breached it is no longer present. The first 2 weeks removed the acute substrate and cleared the immediate consequences: water, liver fat, glucose turbulence, osmotic nocturia. The third week is where the chronic metabolic adaptation begins to shift. Insulin sensitivity, measured by HOMA-IR. Fasting glucose multiplied by fasting insulin divided by 405 improves as the chronic insulin load decreases. The mechanism is receptor biology. Insulin receptors on the surface of muscle cells and liver cells are proteins embedded in the cell membrane. When insulin binds to them, the cell opens its glucose transporters and takes up glucose from the blood. When insulin levels are chronically elevated, when 3 to 5 sugar-containing meals per day maintain insulin above the fasting threshold for most of the waking hours, the cells respond by reducing the number of receptors they express on their surface. This is downregulation, an adaptive response to an excessive signal, the cellular equivalent of turning down the volume when the music is too loud. Damaged is the wrong word. They are internalized, pulled from the cell surface into the interior of the cell and stored. Remove the excessive insulin signal and the cells re-express the receptors on their surface. Sensitivity returns. The timeline for measurable HOMA-IR improvement is 2 to 4 weeks in most interventional studies, consistent with the rate at which cells recycle receptor proteins back to the membrane surface. With less glucose arriving, less insulin is secreted. With less insulin circulating, the receptors upregulate. The cells become more responsive to each unit of insulin. The pancreas secretes less because less is required to achieve equivalent glucose clearance. The pancreatic beta cells, which have been working at elevated output for years, receive their first sustained reduction in workload. David Unwin, a general practitioner in Southport, published a primary care cohort of 154 patients with a mean age of 63 who adopted carbohydrate restriction under medical supervision. The results were clinically significant. Mean systolic blood pressure fell 10.9 millimeters of mercury. Hemoglobin A1C, the 3-month average blood glucose marker that reflects how well glucose has been controlled, improved in the diabetic subgroup. 21.5% of antihypertensive prescriptions were deprescribed because the blood pressure improvement made the medication unnecessary. 12% of type 2 diabetes medications were deprescribed for the same reason. The timeline extended over months, but the direction established within the first 3 weeks and continued linearly. The body responded to the removal of the substrate on a timeline that began quickly and continued for as long as the substrate remained absent. Triglycerides, the blood fat most directly responsive to carbohydrate intake, begin declining within 2 to 3 weeks. Fewer carbohydrates arriving at the liver means less substrate for de novo lipogenesis, means fewer VLDL particles packaged with triglycerides and exported into the bloodstream. The triglyceride decline on the blood test is an identical assembly line slowdown Schwartz measured in the liver with MRI, observed from a different measurement point. That trajectory, water leaving first, liver fat and glucose turbulence clearing second, Nocturia resolving third, insulin sensitivity shifting fourth, is why I lobbed the sock groove, the ring, and the face photograph on day 0 and measured them again every 7 days. The physics predicted the sequence. The measurements confirmed it in my own tissue. The sock groove shallowed by day 5. The ring moved freely by day 7. The jawline sharpened by day 10. The bladder stopped its 2 in the morning appointment by day 12. each change arriving on the timeline the substrate physics predicted. Anyone on insulin or a sulfonylurea medication must not undertake sudden strict carbohydrate reduction without direct medical supervision. These medications are dosed to a specific glucose load. Removing the glucose load without adjusting the medication dose can produce dangerous hypoglycemia, blood glucose dropping below the threshold for normal brain function. This is not theoretical risk. Anyone on these medications needs their prescribing physician involved from day one. Substrate removal is the intervention, not calorie reduction. Total calories remain matched to the baseline. This is not a diet in the conventional sense of eating less. Protein and fat remain stable or increase slightly to replace the caloric gap that removing carbohydrate creates. The single variable that changes, free sugar and refined carbohydrate drop below 50 grams per day. Everything else stays constant. One variable, the same variable Schwartz changed. Predictable shape to the timeline. Days 1 through 3, cravings peak. The body is accustomed to receiving glucose 3 to 5 times daily, and the hypothalamic appetite circuits respond to the absence with increased hunger signaling. Mild headache is common, partly from glycogen depletion altering cerebral glucose supply, partly from caffeine interaction if sweetened coffee was part of the daily pattern. Urination increases as glycogen-bound water releases. Days 4 through 7. Cravings diminish as the metabolic switch completes and the brain adapts to a mixed fuel supply. Energy may dip before steadying. The face begins to change. Depuffing visible in photographs set against day 0. Days 8 through 14. Afternoon crashes flatten. Sleep consolidates if nocturia was glucose-driven. The distinction between aging and substrate effect becomes personally observable for the first time. Days 15 through 21. Energy steadies at a baseline that may feel unfamiliar. Not the peaks and crashes of glucose cycling, but a flat, sustained availability. The metabolic biomarkers, if tested at day 21, show the direction the literature predicts: fasting glucose lower, triglycerides lower, fasting insulin lower. The sock groove measured something you were never told was there: 1.8 kilograms of glycogen-bound water distributed through your tissue. Face, ankles, fingers, midsection replenished daily by a substrate that arrived 3 to 5 times per day for decades. Remove the substrate and the body answers, organ by organ, system by system, each change faster than the decades of accumulation would suggest, each one answering a question it was never asked, a question that required nothing from you except the removal of the single substrate that had been masking the answer for decades. 21 days, one variable, the body answers.